Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. My name is Brenna Marsicek. I'm the Communications and Outreach Director for Madison Audubon, and I'm here today to talk to you about bees and bee nests because they are super awesome. And in particular, we're going to talk about three different types of bees. We're going to focus on bumblebees, leafcutter bees, and mason bees. So if you have questions at all during this, please type them into the comments box and I will try to get to them as soon as I can, assuming that I can see the comments. I'm going to work on getting that page up here in just a second. But to get started, the first reason that we're talking about these types of bees is because they are native. So bumblebees, leafcutter bees, and mason bees are all three types of native bees that we would find in Wisconsin. They've evolved to live here, and they've always been here. Well, not always. They've been here for a long time. They're adapted to the cold winters. They are adapted to hot summers and the types of plants that would grow here. There are hundreds of different types of bees that are native to Wisconsin, hundreds. The one bee that isn't, that most people think about, is the honeybee. Honeybees are native to parts of Europe and Asia, and they were brought over probably because they produce honey, and people found that very useful when they were moving from those parts of the world to the New World, to where we are now. And honeybees need a lot of work to keep them alive through the winter and through the year. They have people who take care of their colonies. Versus these native bees that we're going to be talking about today, which are perfectly fine on their own as long as they have the food, the shelter, the nesting sites, the water that they need. So these bees are native. They're awesome. They are also really, really gentle. So they are not big colony forming bees like a honeybee is. And most native bees are solitary, which means that they never interact with their young. They lay just a few eggs each year and they never interact with their young, which makes them less protective of their hive. So if you get close to a honeybee hive, that might cause the honeybees to sting you because they're trying to protect the hive. If you get close to a native beehive, it probably wouldn't have that same reaction because they're less intensely protective. Another insect that often stings is a wasp, and they are adapted to be predators. They use their stinger to paralyze their prey, and they carry that prey back to the nest. So they use their stinger in a much more aggressive way. Bumblebees are very gentle. Leafcutter bees are also not aggressive, and they only react and sting if they feel like they're going to be squished. So they use their stingers in self-protection. They're also a really diverse group of animals. Bees have so many different shapes, colors, levels of fuzziness, sizes. They have lots of cool adaptations, some of which we're going to talk about today. And I also think that they're pretty cute, especially those bumblebees that are big and fuzzy, and they just are really adorable. They are super, super useful. Bees are very good pollinators because they are looking for pollen. They collect pollen to bring back to their nest. That's what they feed their babies, their larvae. So bees are intentionally at the flower to collect pollen. So they pick up pollen, they move to the next flower, and a lot of times they accidentally drop pollen into the next flower. And that process of moving pollen from flower to flower to flower is what pollination is. And that leads to, eventually, if the flower is pollinated, it would lead to a fruit or a seed. And a lot of that seed we eat. We eat strawberries or coffee or chocolate. There's a ton of different foods that we rely on, animals like bees, to move from flower to flower. So these are all really great reasons to love and talk about bees. The first one that we're going to focus on today is the bumblebee. This is my favorite animal. I'm going to show you a picture of one. I also have a specimen, but first we'll show you the picture so that you have a good sense of what it looks like. I know the words are probably backwards, maybe not. But this is a bumblebee. It is very fuzzy. It's very large. It has a cool stripe pattern on its abdomen. And they are very good at collecting pollen. They have a cool adaptation on their leg that's called a pollen basket. It's an indentation on their back leg that allows them to pack a whole bunch of pollen into that one spot so that they can carry it around. It's basically their pollen purse. So they carry it around. It's that orange little ball of pollen there. So these pollen baskets are super useful for bringing a whole bunch of pollen back to the nest, which they pack into these little pollen pots, and that's what they lay their eggs on. So pollen is super, super important. Here, I'll show you a specimen. Hopefully you can see what we have here. So the specimen is no longer alive. At one point it was, and it was found by our scientist friend who donated it to us. And you can see it has 6 legs because it's an insect. Bees have 4 wings. A lot of times it looks like just 2 because the hind wing has a little, or the front wing has a little hook that attaches to the hind wing. So often it looks like it only has 2 wings when it really has 4. It is very fuzzy. The fuzz is used to collect pollen and capture. It's like Velcro. And it also helps them stay warm, an adaptation for living in a place like Wisconsin. So one of the really interesting things about bumblebees is their life cycle. What you see here, this large specimen that I just showed you, I'll show you again. This is a large, even for a bumblebee, this is large, a large bee, because this is the queen. The queen bees are the ones that you see flying around in the spring, really early in the spring. They are a lot of times buzzing low to the ground. They're looking for a nest site. Bumblebees nest underground, oftentimes, in an abandoned rodent hole or some other cavity that would be underground. The queen bee will collect a whole bunch of pollen. She'll pack it into these little pollen pots that I'll show you in just a second, and she'll lay her egg on top, 1 egg per pollen pot. When that egg hatches, the young will eat the pollen pot, and then it'll use that as a casing for pupating or transforming into an adult. So the queen is responsible for collecting enough pollen to make all those pollen pots to have a brood of young honeybees or bumblebees that will turn into her worker bees. So it's a big job. She has to find the nest site. She has to collect a whole bunch of pollen. She has to lay all those eggs and then keep the eggs alive and safe. So I'll show you what one of these nests look like. This nest was abandoned. It would have been after the nest was finished. So you can see those pollen pots in there would be where the egg would be laid and used as a food source for those baby bees, the larvae. Early in the season, the bumblebee lays only female eggs. So those bees that are coming out this time of year, they're all girls. The girls are the worker bees. They visit all sorts of flowers and collect pollen and bring it back to the nest to create more pollen pots for the queen to lay her eggs on. And that process just keeps repeating. So the colony grows to a couple hundred, could be as few as a couple dozen to a few hundred bees in that colony. Then later in the summer, the queen will switch and start laying the male eggs. And so those eggs will hatch, the males will come out, and they are used only for reproduction. They mate and then they die. Sorry, boys. So those, so that would be later in the summer, early fall. And then once the mating happens, then the worker bees would also die, and the only ones that would be left over then would be the queen bee, the big one that started the colony in the first place, and any future queens. Those queens would then go out searching for a place where they can tuck in for the winter. Sometimes it might be in a compost bin or under a pile of leaves in your garden, somewhere that would be kind of warm and safe for the winter. And that's where they hibernate all winter long. And then in the spring, the queen emerges and starts that whole process again. They're looking for that site, they lay all the eggs, they collect all the pollen, and they form that colony from scratch at the beginning of the year again. Every year, this is how that happens. It's pretty amazing. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of pollen in order for that to happen. So as someone who loves bumblebees, you might be wondering, what can I do to attract bumblebees to my yard? The first and biggest answer would be to have lots of good early spring flowers, right? Because bumblebees come out early in the spring and they need lots of pollen. So having good pollen and nectar sources for those bumblebees early in the year would be the best thing that you can do. You can also look up, I'll drop a link a little bit later on to one of these websites, but you can also look up plans to make a bumblebee box where they can use that site as a nesting site. So you can do that if you want to. It's not super common for a bumblebee to use that, but it's definitely possible. And then also to provide a safe pesticide-free place for these bumblebees to forage and to live. So those are the greatest things that you can do for bumblebees. Early spring flowers, most importantly. So if you have any questions about bumblebees, type them on in. I'm trying to keep an eye on the comment feed over here. The next bee that we're going to talk about is called a leafcutter bee, and I don't have a specimen for this one, so I'll just show you the picture. A leafcutter bee is named that because it cuts leaves. It uses a really cool part or body part on its mouth called a mandible, which is a little scissors. It uses the scissors to visit leaves, like especially a lilac shrub is a favorite place for a leafcutter bee to cut their leaf chunks out. They use their mandible to cut the leaf, then they pick up the leaf chunk with their legs and fly it back to their nest, which they'll use as a nesting material inside of their nest. So first I'll show you the picture because these bees look really cool. So this top picture, this is hard. There we go. This top picture shows the leafcutter bee. It's kind of a small-ish, less than an inch long bee that is dark colored, and then it has some gray bands on its abdomen there. It has a tendency to carry the pollen. Unlike a bumblebee that would carry pollen in its pollen baskets, leafcutter bees carry pollen on their tummy. And so they have these really fuzzy tummies that they use to carry pollen around. And you can also see in this picture that the leafcutter bee is cutting a chunk of this leaf out. They often will cut a semicircle out of the leaf. That is a useful shape for their nest. And I just want to point out that the leafcutter bee does not cause actual life-threatening damage to the plant. It's just an aesthetic change to the leaf. It doesn't damage the plant at all, besides the little tiny chunks that come out. So I'm going to show you what the nest looks like. Leafcutter bee uses a tube to nest. So it will bring you can see there's one end that's open. This other end of the tube is blocked. That's a natural part. This is a bamboo stick. This is a natural part of the bamboo. It has a little block at some point. And so this tube was cut to a certain length and it's a certain width to be attractive and supportive for a leafcutter bee. So the leafcutter bee will pick up that chunk of leaf and fly it back to the nest, and she'll carry it in to the back of the tube where she'll use it like wallpaper. She'll line the inside of the tube with leaf, and then she'll go out, do some foraging, bring some pollen back, create a pollen ball inside where that leaf wallpaper is, and lay an egg on top. And go out, get another chunk of leaf, bring it back, and cap that room off. So there's one pollen ball with an egg in each chamber inside of this tube. So she starts in the very back where this block is. That's the back of her tube, of her nest site. Then she'll lay an egg, block it off, lay an egg, block it off, and she'll keep going all the way until the edge of the tube. So when it's time for the eggs to hatch, they hatch in reverse order, which is amazing. So they start hatching on the outside edge of the tube. So when the first one hatches, it can just move on out, and the next one can hatch and make its way out, and they keep hatching in reverse order until they're all hatched and moved out of the nest. Another cool thing about the way this bee lays its eggs is that because this tube is open on this side, that's a good source of for predators to get in. So like a bird or a spider, they would first access that egg that's in the end of the tube. So the female, the leafcutter bee will lay female eggs, girl eggs, inside, and then at some point toward the end, she'll switch to males. So the males will be laid at the end of the tube here, because in the insect world, males are only used for mating, right? So at least in the bee world. So they are more expendable. So the boys will come out, they'll hatch, and then the girls will hatch and come out. I'll show you what the inside of this tube looks like. It's very, very cool. I'm going to try to not tip it all out. Again, this nest was not harvested from an active nest. It was abandoned. So we would never take something like this out of the wild if it's being used. So you can see each of those little leaf chambers in there. That would have an egg on top of a pollen ball in there. So when the egg hatches, it would eat the pollen. It would pupate inside of this little chamber, transform into adult, and then it would make its way out the tube. Super, super cool. So there are a lot of places that sell tube nesting devices. You can find them at your local hardware store. You can find more prefab ones online or at big box stores. They're very common. Or you can buy a whole bunch of bamboo and look up, I'll drop another link in the comments, but you can look up how long they should be, how big the diameter of the hole should be, etc. So this is a really fun way to attract a native bee to your yard. One thing I didn't mention about this bee is that it's a solitary bee, which means that the adult never interacts with its young. It only lays the egg and then it pieces out, does her own thing, collecting more pollen and drinking nectar, and the bees will hatch here and they come out of the tube and they know exactly what to do. They are really interesting bees. Okay, the third bee that we're going to talk about is a mason bee. It's called a mason bee because masons work with earthen materials. So masons would be like a bricklayer, for example. This type of mason, this mason bee, uses mud to make its nest. It's also a tube nester, so you would find it in a bamboo. This bamboo shoot would be a perfect spot for a mason bee. And it does a very similar life cycle where the adult will lay the eggs inside. She'll cap off each room with its own pollen ball and its own egg on top. But instead of using leaves as a way to divide the room and create this nice wallpaper, she uses mud. So she'll bring some nice gooey dirt back from a site and she'll pack it all the way around and create those chambers. So first egg is laid here in the back, makes our way to the front. The eggs hatch in reverse direction. The best way to tell if you have a tube that has a leafcutter bee or a mason bee would be to look at the color of the plug on the end. So a leafcutter bee, you would have a plug that is green because they're using leaf material. If you have a mason bee, it would be brown because it has mud in there instead. Super cool. Mason bees are also a native solitary bee that never interact with their young. And they're also really good pollinators because they're quite hairy. I'm going to get the glare out of there. So this would be an exceptionally hairy mason bee. And down here, this is another variety of mason bee that's kind of a metallic green looking. Really, really beautiful. Mason bees are known to be really good pollinators of fruit trees. So there are apple growers in this area that have colonies of mason bees that they support because they are able to go out and pollinate under much colder temperatures, and they're very effective at getting into the flowers of those trees. Also carry their pollen on their tummy, so another cool feature of that bee. I think that was the extent of what I wanted to share with you. If you have any more questions, I'm glad to see you guys also love bees in the comments here. Feel free to type them in. I'll show you just a couple more. I have a couple specimens that would be kind of fun to see. This one is a mason bee. You can see it's a lot smaller than the bumblebee. Also has 6 legs, of course, because it's an insect, 4 wings. Bees have 3 parts of their body. So they have the head where their eyes and mouths and antennae are located. And then a little further back is the thorax, which is where the legs and the wings are attached. And then they have their abdomen, which is where they do a lot of digesting and whatnot. That's also where the stinger is attached. So this is a mason bee. It's quite small. And I'm going to show you one more type of bee that I'm not going to talk about the nest too much. I can't resist though, because they're super cool. This is a sweat bee. I'm going to try and get it closer so you can see the super cool color. This is a green metallic sweat bee. It is just beautiful. Sweat bees are ground nesters, so they sort of like an ant would form their colony underground. So a lot of times you can't tell from looking at the top if you're looking at the ground, and you see like a little pile of sand or dirt around the opening of a hole. You may not be able to tell if it's an anthill or a bee nest unless you see the insect going in or out. Also, very good bees. They're known to land on people because they drink the sweat in your perspiration. They drink the salt in your perspiration, and that's an important part of their diet. So that's all I have for you for bees. So the last thing that we should talk about is how to best support bees in your yard. As I mentioned with bumblebees, you can provide a nesting spot by having a box, or like with leafcutter and mason bees, you can go out and buy or sort of DIY your own tubes like this. The tubes are much more successful than a bumblebee nest box, but you can give both of them a whirl, and there are lots of instructions on how to do that. But they're also really good at finding their own nesting sites. So a leafcutter bee might be able to use like a hole in a fence pole, or a old raspberry cane, that type of thing. So if your yard isn't perfectly manicured and you have some leaf matter laying around, that's great. Bees really benefit from that. And especially these native bees that nest in these very curious locations. They really like the yards that aren't perfectly manicured. If you can avoid using herbicides and pesticides, that really is great for all types of insects. The native, obviously you would be using them to get rid of some type of insect, but it doesn't prevent the good ones from dying if you use an herbicide or a pesticide. Another great thing to have in your yard, of course, are flowers that would be flowering throughout the year. And to make sure that the flowers that you have in your garden are pollen and or nectar producing. We have lots of really interesting cultivars of flowers that would have like a double. You have a double cone flower, which means that the inside of the flower head would also have petals coming out of it, where there should be just kind of that flat cone part. That adaptation in the flower takes away what would have been a pollen and nectar source. That's a mutation in the plant that turns the reproductive part of the plant, which produces pollen and nectar, into a petal. So when you remove the pollen and nectar to get the flower, you're removing a food source, a really important food source for bees. So if you can look for straight up natives or really good pollen and nectar producing plants, that's the best. And then the last thing would be a water source. Insects need to drink water, of course, and some of that they can get through nectar, but they also benefit from having something like a mud puddle or a bird bath around. Unfortunately, or interestingly, insects aren't strong enough to break the water tension in a bird bath. So you have, in a glass, you have the top of the water, there's a line here. They can't break through that top of the water without there being something in there to help them. So if you can float a stick or some leaves on top of your bird bath, that really helps insects be able to access it, including butterflies. Butterflies are this way as well. So with that, I don't see any comments here. So if you are watching this later on and you drop a comment into the comment section, we'll get back to it and answer it as soon as we can. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your love for bees and insects, and have a great rest of your day.